You will never, ever, ever have a career in singing.
Liam Payne's passing left a lot of people absolutely devastated, including Simon Cowell, who's even had to take a break from his work because of the news. But it might actually be him who is really to blame for what happened to Liam. What did Simon do that ultimately led to Liam suffering so much? And is he doing anything to protect others from the same fate? Back in the day when One Direction first formed, nobody thought that we would one day be here. At that point, nobody even knew that these 5 guys would become one of the most popular boy bands of all time. And the 5 of them were really just children back then, which is what makes this whole story just so devastating. The boys of One Direction didn't really have the time to live out their childhoods to the fullest, because some of them were only 16 years old when they got launched into show business and became superstars. They might not have won their season of the X Factor, but they definitely had the X Factor, the key ingredient to success, in them. Or was it just careful marketing and promotion that really put them in the position they ended up in? Even though they were so young, suddenly, their whole lives changed, and after their X Factor success, they barely had time to do anything other than work. It would be a really difficult situation for anyone. Suddenly, becoming famous practically overnight and then having to do the work to keep up with the demands of the industry would be challenging for anyone. And One Direction were really just kids. But the industry didn't care about that. They got signed to a label, and from there on out, they had to work super hard to keep up with the demands of the job. And at the beginning of it all was Simon Cowell. He and the other X Factor judges were the one who made the 5 of them into a group. Because initially, Liam, Harry, Zayn, Lewis, and Niall all auditioned individually. It wasn't until they were all already on the X Factor that One Direction was formed. And it was Simon who really did the work in putting them together. Although it was actually Nicole Scherzinger who first suggested that these guys should even form a group. But once it was decided, Simon was the one who took over and really made the whole thing work. He saw the potential that they had as a boy band, and not just when it comes to the music and the art that they could make together. It was also the marketing potential that comes with boy bands in general. And Simon could just tell that One Direction could be really successful. It was even his own record label, Psycho Music, that they first signed with in the very beginning. And it was Simon who really got them started and made sure they would make it on the road to fame. But what that meant was endless work hours and exhaustion, because suddenly the boys were expected to release new music quickly, but also to perform and travel the world on tour. And this would already be a lot on its own. But on top of that, they had to deal with suddenly being extremely famous out of nowhere. And that might sound nice when you just hear it said like that, but in reality, being famous is just mentally extremely difficult. Suddenly, you can't just go outside like you were used to because it's not safe anymore. And if you do go outside, there are people everywhere freaking out because they see you. That is something that's really hard to imagine if you haven't been through it yourself. But in the long term, this was harder on Liam than it was on anyone else. After One Direction eventually split up, everyone else was able to move on in their own way. The other 4 members have all been pretty successful releasing their own music. But for Liam, that just wasn't the case. It's not that he didn't try his hand at being a solo artist, but he just wasn't very successful at it. And recently, he even got dropped by his record label, which is just insane to think about, considering that he was once part of One Direction. The Daily Mail actually revealed that Liam was dropped by his label, Universal Music, just days before his passing. And while the news wasn't really out publicly, Liam would have definitely known about it. It would have been one of the things on his mind in his last few days here, which is honestly just completely tragic. And to think that in the beginning, he was actually at least partially the reason why One Direction was formed, at least based on what Liam himself said on Logan Paul's podcast one time. He explained the whole story of what supposedly happened. And once again, Simon was right in the middle of it all. The thing is, Liam had actually been on the X Factor one time before. In 2010, when One Direction was formed, he was only 16 years old. But it was actually his second time auditioning for the show. His first time was 2 years prior when he was just 14. He actually got pretty far in the competition. He was about to make it to the live shows, but at the last minute, he got kicked off. And it was actually Simon himself who did it. Liam explained on the podcast that later, Simon told him that he had to kick him off because Liam was just too young. But famously, he told him to come back and audition again in 2 years. And he kind of promised that the second time around, he would make the show work for him. So, fast forward to 2010, Liam was auditioning again. And at one point, things really weren't looking good. He got kicked off again, and he thought that it would be the last time. But then he and the others got brought back on and told that they could all continue together as a group. And obviously, we all know what happened after that. But what Liam said was that later, Simon actually told him that part of the reason why he made sure that One Direction actually formed was because of him. It was the promise that he made to him 2 years prior that made him really try and find a way to make things work for Liam this time. By the sound of it, Simon pretty much actually just formed One Direction for Liam. Although, obviously, this was what Liam himself said. And the story wasn't really very well received at that point, especially because Liam already had a history of saying some not so nice things about the other One Direction members after the band split. But regardless of what the truth of it really was, it's obvious that Simon really liked Liam a lot. The two of them were pretty close. Simon even revealed in his Instagram post that Liam would come to visit him just to hang out and chat. Not about anything business related, but just because the two of them were pretty close friends. So it makes a lot of sense that Simon seems to be just completely devastated right now. A source told The Sun that Simon was hit really hard by the news. They said that he was not just close to Liam himself, but also to his family. And he didn't even want to continue working on Britain's Got Talent, which is filming right now. The whole filming was paused because of Liam's passing. But Simon decided to take a longer break from it. So for at least some of the season, he will be replaced by someone else on the judges panel. It's pretty clear that Simon is just really not okay after Liam's passing. And part of the reason for that might be that he knows that in part, it's also his fault, because it's not even just the fact that he passed away. He was also pretty open about how much he had been struggling with his mental health in recent years. And as Rebecca Ferguson said in her tweet, there's a good chance that if he hadn't been on the show and hadn't been a part of One Direction, he would be alive today. Rebecca was on the X Factor in the same year as One Direction, and so was another one of Liam's friends, Katie Weissel. And both of them have been speaking out about the real problem here, which is that the music industry values profit over people. It exploits even young kids like the boys from One Direction were back in the day, and it can really destroy people from the inside out. It's high time that something changed, and maybe Liam's passing could be the thing that finally makes a change happen. But anyway, what do you guys think? Were you fans of Liam and One Direction? Let me know in the comments below.